welcome to Served Up. This podcast is where hospitality meets leadership and where we take an honest look at the business of beverage. I'm Bridget Albert. I've spent my career building cocktail programs, mentoring rising talent, judging competitions, and advocating for women in our industry. I'm joined by my co-host, Eric Heemer, one of only 5 people in the world to hold both the Master Sommelier and Master of Wine titles. His depth of knowledge and global perspective brings tremendous insight to every conversation. This is Served Up.
Hello, everyone. It's Eric here. Bridget and I were excited to talk with our guest, Juan Muñoz-Oca, the Estates Director and Chief Operating Officer for the Marchesi Antinori Wine Estates in the United States. Our conversation focused mainly on one of Napa Valley's most famous wineries, Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, as they celebrate the 50th anniversary of the famous Judgement of Paris, in which wines from Napa Valley beat the very best of Burgundy and Bordeaux. We also touched upon Juan's interesting past, from beginning his winemaking journey in his native Argentina to following his dream literally around the world before landing in Napa Valley. Now we invite you to pour yourself a glass of Stag's Leap, sit back, relax, and enjoy this podcast with Juan Muñoz-Oca. This is my very first episode on Served Up. I'm very happy to be joining Bridget as co-host, and I'm really happy to introduce our guest today, who is a special individual, and he's going to be talking about a very, very special occasion in the upcoming month. I'm going to go ahead and get started and say, Juan, welcome to Served Up. It's so nice to have you.
Hey, Eric. It's my absolute pleasure. Just like you, my first time on the pod today.
Yeah, let's make it our best one yet. It's because it's our first one. It will be, right? Correct. So let's talk a little bit about you and your background first before we get into some other topics. We'd love to hear a little bit about where you're from, how you got into the wine industry, where you are today, how you got there. You know, what were your dreams and aspirations as a young boy? Did you want to be in the wine industry? Did you want to be a football player? Let's hear about Juan.
You got both right. I wanted to be a football player and I wanted to be in wine. I am very lucky to be where I am doing what I love and in the conditions that I feel are the best conditions to do wine. And I'll tell you why I love wine after I have shared with you how I got here. I grew up in Argentina, in Mendoza, which is wine country for those who don't know. I grew up in a family that was involved in winemaking. My grandpa was a cellar master. My dad worked for a winery. And grandpa lived on site at this winery. And so every weekend going to his house was actually going to a vineyard and a winery. And I have fond memories of running around in between barrels and riding bikes in between vineyards. And I think I never thought that I would do anything other than being involved in that world. I didn't know what was the path to be involved with wine, winemaker, viticulturist, marketer, salesperson, sommelier. I just wanted to be in that world. Had a brief summer in which I thought I was going to be a football, soccer player. But again, luck will have it, I grew up in Argentina where those players abound and were all much better than me. So those dreams were crushed, no pun intended, one lovely fall. And we went off to the races. I studied agricultural engineering in Mendoza in Argentina. With a degree in enology and viticulture, so it was dual degrees. But I think the agricultural engineering in my mind was the foundation of a good wine person. If you know how to grow grapes, you're like halfway there, right?
Yes.
And understanding the soil and how those factors interact with wine was perhaps my goal. And quickly after I finished school, I started working for LVMH. They own a winery in Argentina called Chandon. In fact, 2 wineries. There's another one called Terrazas de los Andes, which is the still winemaking facility for LVMH in Mendoza. That was my first harvest professionally. Quickly left Argentina to explore what was happening around the world. And my idea was to go and figure out how people express their unique terroir, how they use the levers that are at their hands, like the levers that they have at their disposal, to kind of guide grapes to express the uniqueness of their terroir. That search took me to South Australia, Spain, France, and ultimately to Washington State in the US. And I found in Washington an inspiring terroir and a winery that was full of very talented people, and it became home. I spent 20 years in 20 beautiful vintages in Washington State, working with wines in the Pacific Northwest. And 2 years ago, in the summer of 2023, with the Antinori family purchased Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, I was lucky enough to be called to work with them, managing this project, which is the most iconic and historic winery in Napa, and perhaps one of the most iconic wineries in the US. I don't know what they were thinking, but I didn't ask Eric. I just said yes and jumped on a plane and moved to Napa. And as I was saying earlier, I feel like it's the culmination of a search for a place in which I can feel that I'm contributing, that I'm doing good, not only for the people around me, but perhaps more importantly, for people that will come in generations in the future. And I could not be happier where I am.
Yeah, that's a fantastic story. And that last thing that you just said sort of echoes the Antinori philosophy. It's not just for the here and now, but it's also for future generations. And they know a thing or two about generations, which we'll talk about. Just for those of you that may not be familiar with LVMH, just to backtrack a moment, that stands for Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, one of probably the leading luxury goods provider in the world, including some very prestigious wineries. So, Juan, you had a really great training background, and then you were literally a flying winemaker going around the world, to the Southern Hemisphere, to the Northern Hemisphere, learning the trade and getting international viewpoints. And what a fantastic story that is. And ending up at Stag's Leap really seems like kismet, like the ultimate consummation of your journey. So that's really, really fantastic. For those of you that may not be familiar, Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, as Juan mentioned, is a very historic winery that dates to 1970. And just so you know, there's another winery out there called Stag's Leap Winery, which is a completely different winery. We're talking here about Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. So this is probably a good time, if you don't mind, Juan, to talk a little bit about the establishment of Stag's Leap Wine Cellars and what's going on with them this year.
Yeah, absolutely. The history of Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, I think, can be told through the lens of two visionary winemakers. I'll start with Warren Winiarski, the founder of Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. He planted a flag in the Stag's Leap district in 1970, as you were saying. Just a reminder, back in the day, we all thought the Stag's Leap district was too cold for Cabernet Sauvignon. And a little further up the valley, if you're familiar with Napa and Rutherford and Oakville, was kind of like the warmer area where Cabernet was king.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Warren was a philosophy professor at the University of Chicago, made wine at home, of Polish descent, and made wine at home like many Europeans did back then. Fell in love with wine, and one day decided to move to Napa to try his luck in winemaking. He ended up working for Robert Mondavi, in fact, became Robert Mondavi's first winemaker. But he always had this search for the wine that will represent who he was as a winemaker. And that vision took him to Stag's Leap District. He planted a flag in 1970, immediately planted a vineyard the year after that he called SLV. He called the winery Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, the vineyard Stag's Leap Vineyard. He was brought to Stag's Leap District by a good friend, Nathan Fay, who actually was the first grower to plant Cabernet Sauvignon in the appellation. And that Cabernet brought Warren to the district because I think it represented a good expression of Cabernet that matched perfectly his vision for his own personal wine. And as I said, visionary, not because he was at the right time or the right place, but because he had a clear idea of where he wanted to go and did all the steps that he needed to do in order to get to that vision. In 1973, he harvested grapes from SLV, his own vineyard, Now, he had his winery in production for a couple of years, but this was the first vintage of that wine. And nobody knew, but 3 years later, that wine will be perhaps the wine that changed everything for the wine industry.
Yeah, that's for sure. You can say that again. Just want to take a step back. And, at the time in 1966, when Warren went to work for Robert Mondavi, Mondavi was just completing construction of the first new winery post-Prohibition in Napa Valley. And for those that don't know the term Prohibition, between 1920 and 1933, it became illegal to commercially produce wine and sell it. And of course, that was all the result of decades of campaigning by the temperance movement, who wanted to outlaw the sale of alcoholic beverages. So for 13 years, Napa Valley was shut down. And prior to that, there was some 800 wineries operating in California. After that, there was just a few dozen remaining. And Napa Valley was a much different place than it is today. For those of you that have been, it's a very prestigious valley, very agricultural, but it's all it's all monoculture. It's all grapevines. But back then they grew plums and cherries and walnuts and all kinds of other stuff. So 1970, when Warren, purchased his land, Napa Valley was a very, very different place. And I think he shared Robert Mondavi's vision that he didn't want to make huge, powerful, structured wines. He wanted to make subtle wines that were supple on the palate and sort of emulated the great estates of Bordeaux. And that's kind of how he was shaping that. Am I correct there, Juan?
That's absolutely right. For the longest time, silly me, I thought, well, Warren was at the right place at the right time, found the right grapes, made the wine correctly, and the rest of the story. We'll get into the rest of the story here shortly. I now understand that he had a vision and a perspective for the wine, and he did what he had to do in order to deliver on that vision. And that what makes him a visionary. And I now admire not only his work and his vision, but also his method and how hard he worked tirelessly to deliver the wine that he had envisioned.
It really is such an amazing story. It's just sitting here listening to both of you, paint the picture of Napa in the 1970s, right? Typically when I think about the 1970s, guys, I'm thinking about like bell bottoms and big dreams, truly, right? And so can you paint that picture even just a little bit further and talk about, how hard it was? I think it'd be very hard to imagine what's happening next in this story. And did anybody even have a hint with what was about to happen?
I will tell you from the perspective of Warren and Barbara Bruniarski, it was a labor of love. It was a passion-driven endeavor. I don't think anybody thought that the valley will become what it is today. I understand that they wanted to make wine in a beautiful place in the world and share those wines with friends and family. And we're not expecting what happened to the valley and to the wine industry and ultimately to the American wine consumer. We are not only the largest consumer of wine in the world on value, we're also a very savvy wine consumer here in the United States. And I believe that a lot of that is due to folks like Bob Mondavi and Warren Winiarski that led the way and make wines that had not only a perspective, it had a soul, like wines that carry that passion that they use to fuel their business.
Yeah. Can you tell us what happens next in the story?
I'd be delighted to tell you what happens next. So Warren founded the winery in 1970, released its first vintages in 71 and 72. The 73 vintage was made for the first time with his own grapes. Until now, he was using grapes grown by his friend and neighbor, Nathan Fay. That wine was picked up by a delightful Brit that sold wine in Paris, Stephen Spurrier. Because Stephen spent a good amount of time, although he lived in Paris, he spent a good amount of time in California. His wife was American, and they will travel to California often. As a wine lover, he tried a lot of the offerings that California had at that time, which again, Eric was just articulated this beautifully. Napa was not what it is today, yet there were a handful of family-owned businesses that had the same passion and drive that the likes of Bob Mondavi and Warren Winiarski had. So there was wine being made, and Stephen was very impressed by these wines. And year after year, he took some wines with him every time he flew back home to Europe. He couldn't convince his fellow wine lovers in Europe that the wines of California had something going on, that they were perhaps as good in quality and as any other wine around the world. And of course, everybody laughed at his thought that these wines could stand shoulder to shoulder with wines made elsewhere. And so to celebrate the 200th anniversary, the bicentennial of America in 1976, he organized a blind tasting of wines from California against wines from France. And this was who's who of the French winemaking at the time. So he paired some Chardonnays from California with Burgundies from France. He paired some Cabernets, mostly from Napa, to Cabernets from Bordeaux, or Bordeaux blends from Bordeaux. And again, who's who of the wine world in Bordeaux. And set up a blind tasting, which was brilliant on his part. And again, it was meant to be this celebration. It meant to be this exercise that will show the judges and mostly his buddies that had been denying him the pleasure of showing California wines in Europe a little bit of what's happening in America with these wines. And to everybody's surprise, especially the judges were very prestigious French judges, most of them, 7 of the 9. And to everybody's surprise, 2 American wines, 2 wines from Napa, came first on the Chardonnay, a beautiful Chardonnay from Chateau Montelena, and in the Cabernet flight, the 1973 SLV from Stag's Wine Cellars, besting what at the time was understood like the best wines from France. And it was shocking to the judges and everybody present, but it was not shocking to the folks back home that received the news with a lot of optimism. And I think it was just fueling their passion and fuel their dedication to be better.
I was reading one time, Juan, about the judges, and as you mentioned, I don't think that Spurrier and Patricia Gallagher actually voted. Their votes didn't count. So all of the judges that actually tallied the blind tasting results were all French. And one of the judges was so outraged that she demanded her ballot back. She couldn't believe that the Americans could possibly have topped the great wines of Burgundy and Bordeaux. So it was literally the shot heard around the world in the wine world at the time. It must have been amazing. And one more thing I want to point out, too, is that this might not have had such a monumental effect, but there was an American reporter in the room. The only journalist that covered the event was a guy named George Tabor, who was there from Time Magazine. It must have been a slow news day. So he said, let's go cover this tasting and see what it's all about. And he wrote an article that was published in Time Magazine in June of that year, which is how this, all the information got started. And it just created a huge furor in the wine world. It's just an amazing thing. It was probably much like the Americans beating the British in the Revolutionary War. Nobody thought it could happen,
but it did. It's amazing.
But it did. I picture that, Eric. I'm sure this happened to you before. You're like do a blind tasting. You are sure that what you're tasting, smelling, it's something, and then it turns out to be something different, and you're like disappointed that you didn't see it coming. And it's happened to me before, but I just can't. All I can think about is this one judge that was asking for her ballot back to check the math. Can you, Stephen, double check the math? Is this what just happened? I can only imagine. Her name was Odette Kahn, and she got up and asked for her card back. Let me see that. It's impossible.
And she was one of the most prestigious French wine critics. She wrote for La Revue de la Vin de France, which was, at the time, the the Bible when it came to, French wine. So she must have been really embarrassed, I'm sure.
I'm sure she was. I think I feel like there's so much drama here, gentlemen, that this should be a Netflix series and we should be binge watching this rather than talking about it. My God. It's wild. And I love, Eric, that you gave George Tabor just this lovely nod of gratitude, right? How critical was his article to the global scape and to the trajectory, really, of Napa Valley?
Oh, I mean, it can't be overstated how important it was, because it probably would have been quickly smothered by the French press, had somebody there from America not said, hey, this is a great story. It's the bicentennial, 1976, and American wines have just beat the best in the world, French wine. So it was, I'm sure his editor said, yes, please write that article. And then he wrote a book about it a couple of years later, which is called The Judgment of Paris. And that's, there's a famous Greek myth called The Judgment of Paris too, but it doesn't have anything to do with this. But it was just a Parisian wine tasting, but it became known as The Judgment of Paris. And that's what George Tabor entitled his article, and it was also the title of his book. So if anybody's out there that wants to read a really great story, not necessarily about wine, but sort of a David and Goliath story, it's a great one to pick up and read.
I love David and Goliath story. Always.
Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Always rooting for the little guy. From what I know is that when your wine ends up in the Smithsonian, correct?
I have a hard time thinking about this. So wine.
We need to talk about it, Juan, because when your wine is next to Dorothy's ruby slippers and the Wright brothers plane, I want to know how you process this as a winemaker, because it's so fabulous.
That's exactly what I mean when I say that I have a hard time thinking about it, because the wine that wins the Judgment of Paris, of course, George, through his Time magazine article, articulates beautifully the story of David and Goliath. Of course, the wine world reacts to it, and we'll chat about it, because I have talked to people in the wine world outside Napa in California, in Washington, in Oregon, and New York State, outside the United States, people that make wine in Argentina, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and folks that were inspired by the work that these grape growers were doing in Napa and winning, besting these beautiful French wines, gave them the courage to chase that as a winemaking goal, represent their terroir in a way that can compete with the best wines around the world. I've heard this from Dr. Catena, who runs the beautiful Catena Zapata in Mendoza. So this is a continent away, thinking about how impactful this wine was to them and their trajectory in winemaking. But you were making a good comment about this, a bottle of 1973 SLV from Stag's Wine Cellars being in the Smithsonian. And that part is impressive enough, but when I think about the articles that actually made America, that share space with this bottle of wine, you mentioned a couple that are incredible. Wright brothers plane. There is also George Washington's uniform, which it's so deeply ingrained in who we are as a country. And just the fact that there's a bottle of wine there, I think speaks volume of how we feel about wine in the United States and how far we've come as a wine knowledge and wine drinking country. But perhaps more importantly, how impactful this wine was for us as a country.
Yes, indeed. It really makes quite a statement when you list all of the other prestigious and priceless artifacts that are there, along with this bottle of wine that, was the shot fired around the wine world. So that was 50 years ago. So this is the 50th anniversary of the Judgment of Paris, Juan. Can you tell us what Stag's Leap Wine Cellars is doing to celebrate this famous occasion? Are we promoting it in any particular way?
We are very excited about the 50th anniversary. Again, I have been with the winery for a couple of years, and I witnessed over the last 2 years the evolution of these beautiful wines, I witnessed every single one of the celebrations that we've done before, the 10th year anniversary, 20th, 25th, most recently the 40th. And we are excited about the 50th anniversary for a couple of reasons. I think chief amongst them is that the 2023 vintage, which are the wines that will be released this year, and the 50th anniversary of the wine that won the Judgement of Paris, are just stunning. 2023 was perhaps the vintage of the century. It's one of those like once in a lifetime vintage. And I do realize the winemakers will tell you always that the vintage they're working on is the best one ever. But in this case, it's true. In this case, it was just perfect. And so we're excited to have the 2023 wines out celebrating the 50th anniversary because they're just perhaps the best we've made in a couple of decades. It's a vintage, the vintage of a generation. We made these wines thinking about the Judgement of Paris. And in fact, we have a couple of special bottlings that I'll talk to you about in a minute. But I think we're excited about that because of the wines. And we are excited because we are celebrating a momentous occasion that feels like a great closing to Warren's legacy. Warren Winiarski called his friend Marchesi Antinori a few years back and asked him to buy his winery. And Marchesi said, which, by the way, 25th generation grape grower and winemaker in Tuscany. That family started making wine in 1385. So they know a thing or two about winemaking. He was great friends with Warren Winiarski, and Warren called Marchesi and said, I would like for you to be the steward of my legacy. I want you to buy the winery. And Marchesi said, well, it's the winery for sale. And Warren said, it's not for sale. I want you to buy it. And 2 summers ago, in the summer of 2023, Marchesi and the rest of the Antinori family and organization fulfill this promise to a buddy. And they took ownership of Stag's Wine Cellars. And it's special because Warren was still alive. And I have never seen Warren happier. I have not spent a lot of time with Warren pre-acquisition, but I was lucky enough to spend a good amount of time with him that fall between the summer of 2023 and the end of harvest 2023. And he was beyond happy to know that the legacy that he had built was in good hands. And I think equally happy was Marchesi Antinori with how, like, the fulfillment of a promise, it's not only our responsibility, but more importantly, it's what we are building for generation 27 and 28 and 29, and which is the way in which the Antinori family thinks about wine. In terms of in generational terms, we continue to plant trees in which shade will never be able to sit, under which shade will never be able to have a glass of wine. This is not for us. This is for whoever comes after us. Just lovely.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I can't think of a better steward for the legacy of Warren Winiarski out there in the whole world than the Antinori family. And of course, the 3 daughters, Piero Antinori's daughters, are the 26th generation. And I'm sure the 27th generation is already in the wings. And yeah, it's just an amazing thing. And I'm sure that Warren, when he passed very happy and satisfied. So thank you for sharing that with us, Juan. And I know you mentioned some special bottlings that you have coming out this year also to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Judgement of Paris. Can you tell us about those a little?
Yeah, thank you for bringing me back to how we are celebrating. So I told you we were thinking about the 50th anniversary as the harvest was coming in. As we were prepping these wines, we were getting more and more excited about how beautiful the vintage was, kind of a gift in many ways. And we made a wine we have a portion of SLV vineyard. It has not been replanted. So it's the original vines planted in the early 70s by Warren. And that block makes a very special wine every year. And in 2023 was not an exception. The wine was beautiful. This is a very small production. And when we were tasting the wine, we quickly realized that we had about 4,000 bottles of this wine. And when you divide those bottles into magnums, 1.5 liter bottles, it just happened to be 1973 bottles. And so we are bottling that wine in magnums.
Wow.
And we are numbering the bottles, and it's going to be 1,976 bottles of the 2023 SLV. So it's kind of like a 50th anniversary edition of it. We are delighted. This will be a collector's item. The wine is stunning. We're also celebrating the Judgment of Paris, celebrating Napa, celebrating our community. It's not only about Stag Wine Cellars. It's not only about Chateau Montelina, who was the winner on the Chardonnay flight. It's about Napa, the wineries that participated in the Judgment of Paris, and all the wineries that came after. It's about celebrating a place that showed that great terroir, was not only available in France and Italy and Spain. It showed that the New World had also the layers and the components that were needed to create beautiful wines that tell a wonderful story. And so we're celebrating the community, and we're celebrating around the United States. We are going to have wine dinners with verticals of Stag Wine Cellars wines. We have a rich library, and we want to share that with our fans, our friends and family, and of course, the American consumer, the ones to learn more about what makes Napa special. So these dinners are all over the country. They started a couple of weeks ago, and they're going to continue all the way until the end of the year. If you want to attend one, or you are hoping to organize one, you're a restaurateur and want to organize one, you are a consumer and you want to attend one, you just keep an eye on our website, stagslipwinecellars.com. Or if you're a restaurateur, you talk to your distributor partner, or you talk to anybody in our sales force. We call our sales force Vinatieri 1385. That's the Italian word for vigneron, grape grower, vintner. And just reach out to us, and we'll be delighted to tell you what's the next event close to you and how you can get your hands on any of these beautiful wines, how you can get your hands into any of these tickets to go and hear us brag about not only what we're doing today in Napa, but with what Napa has done over the last 5 decades of winemaking.
That's absolutely amazing. I have a question for you, Juan, about, when we talk about this importance of the 50th anniversary judgment that happened in Paris, do you think a blind tasting like this could disrupt the world of wine the same way today? Or do you think it was just like lightning in a bottle kind of a thing that happened back then?
I would love to hear both of your perspectives on this. I feel like it was lightning in a bottle, once in a lifetime. I think the effect of that blind tasting are still influential today. That's why we're celebrating, and that's why we're making a big deal out of all of this. That's why we have been doing that for the last 50 years. I don't know if today a blind tasting will have the same effect. I think we are all today, we are all experts. And if we are not experts, our voice matters. I think in the 70s, we felt like we didn't know enough wine. We didn't know enough about the craft to be good judges. And so having professionals judging your wine was perhaps more important than today. I feel like we learn a little bit more today from our peers, and we listen to each other talk about wine. We do have amazing wine professionals that guide our learning journey through wine. I am amazed by people that can dedicate their lives to wine and become a master sommelier or a master of wine. These are just like the dedication and the amount of focus that takes for you to get there. It's incredible. So I appreciate that as a guidance. But I think we, as wine consumers, we care about what our peers think about a wine. We are finally getting to a point in which we just care about the wine that we like or not. And is it the wine great or not? And wine quality, it's less related to what people are telling us, and it's more related to do I like it or not? which I think is the natural evolution of a wine drinker.
Yes. And I can add to that, too. I think that winemaking in Bordeaux in particular has changed a lot in the ensuing 50 years. And also climate change has played a role. If you look back at the wines of 1970, 1971 that were tasted from Bordeaux in the Judgement of Paris, stylistically, they were very different. They were lower in alcohol. They had higher acidity. They didn't have the opulent fruit structure that you now get today. So I think for many reasons, Bordeaux has moved closer to the Napa Valley style of red winemaking. Maybe less so with Chardonnay, but I think it would be harder to clearly delineate these days which wines were made in Napa and which wines were made in Bordeaux, unless you're truly, a specialist and taste a lot of Bordeaux wines. I think it would be much more challenging today. And I think the overall quality of both Californian and French wines would be quite a degree higher, too, because to your point, Juan, California now has 50 additional years of winemaking under their belts. So they've learned a lot in those 50 years.
There's a component, too, of maybe guided by the Judgement of Paris, maybe guided by the work that these visionaries winemakers had in the work that they did in Napa. But there is, in my mind, there has been an evolution of every little wine region around the world and how they express their unique terroir, right? So we think about Marlborough and we think about Sauvignon Blanc in a very specific way of making Sauvignon Blanc. We think about Mendoza, Argentina, where I grew up, and we think about Malbec. And again, a very special way of presenting Malbec. And so I think it'll be harder today to compare and contrast wine regions as we have worked over the last 5 decades into specializing in how to express our terroir. We think about California, and it's no longer just Napa. It's Napa and Sonoma and the Central Coast, and it's Paso. And we think about Oregon and Pinot Noir, and as of late, Chardonnay. We think about Washington, and for the longest time, which is Riesling. And now it's Riesling and Cabernet and Merlot. And I can go on and on about wine regions around the world. So it'll be harder, I think, for us to compare and contrast as we try to specialize in what we do really, really well, which I think that's, again, the normal evolution of a wine region, if you will.
Yes. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's about time for me to thank you for sharing your story with us. It's a fascinating story, both your personal story and the evolution of Stag's Leap Wine Cellars. So thank you for being here on Served Up. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to the next time.
I appreciate the invite. I had so much fun. Let's do this sometime soon again.
Juan, does that mean that you'll come back?
I'll come back anytime you ask me to.
Okay, I'm going to hold you to that. And I want to just wish you some great health and a lot of peace. Thank you for being on Served Up with Eric and I. This has been such a pleasure.
Thank you both.
Thanks for listening. Served Up is brought to you by Southern Glazer's Wine and Spirits. Produced by Zunu.online. Music by We Killed the Lion can be found on Spotify. Make sure to subscribe to be notified of our future Served Up episodes. Cheers.